I'm really excited to talk to everyone today about this idea of this stable interpersonal realities. It's a kind of new concept that I'm working on, and I'm keen to test it out. So I'm a faculty member in the School of Computing Science in the University of Glasgow. But as you'll kind of see as I go through my talk, my intellectual home is maybe somewhere quite interdisciplinary. And so somewhere between maybe computing and social psychology and somewhere else, I'm not really sure. But what I want to start by talking about this image here. And this is me on a lane in Glasgow, obviously wearing a Gear VR headset. And the reason why I like this image is because in terms of technology, this completely works. This is 3 degrees of freedom tracking device. I can stand there in the lane, I can enjoy this content. It completely works. Socially, this does not work. Even staging these types of photos get a lot of attention. People who use immersive tech here know how fun it is to kind of run up to someone who's in VR and scare them. And it's socially, this completely doesn't work. Even for the people who are there kind of on the street, seeing that this thing, I'm wearing this thing, they don't necessarily know what I'm doing. They don't know what I'm seeing. And the social collisions are just, right now, sort of unmanageable. This isn't a realistic way to walk around the streets in Glasgow. And we've done these types of breaching experiments with all sorts of headsets. And yes, they technically work. Socially, they completely start to fall apart. So a lot of the work that I've been doing is looking at the kind of social barriers and when technology kind of gets in the way of interpersonal interaction. And a lot of this starts from the kind of tradition of proxemics and proxemics in physical spaces. So proxemics describes how we use physical space and how the presence of others influences our behaviors, interactions, and movements. And this is a really well-established area of research, and especially the types of areas that I like from urban sociology. William White and in Jan Gel's work really shows how people move through the city and how the kind of layout of different things impacts how people use space. But one of the things that I find especially interesting is how the technology changes the way people use space. So in this case, this is a kind of street installation, which I can explain, where I do a lot of work with spherical displays, which have a lot of interesting uses in public settings. And in this case, this is a pedestrianized walkway that is on the campus at University of Glasgow, and we placed this kind of walk up and use experience there. So the sphere is at the center, and it's surrounded by a ring of boxes. And if you enter the circle and touch the sphere, you can activate the boxes. It's a really simple, playful interaction. But what we were interested to see is how does this actually change the way people move through this space? Because pedestrian traffic is actually very sensitive to changes in the environment. So we wanted to see what does this change the way people use space. And so this was analyzed using basically CCTV-style cameras that are kind of placed above the walkway. And we can kind of see even in this walkway, which I have lots and many hours of video of, we can see how different changes in the walkway change the way people use it, how people crowd, where they stand. And so I have a lot of interesting examples of this specific space and how sensitive the pedestrian traffic is. So for example, just the way it's laid out, there's certain bollards that people tend to walk through. One day I was looking through the data, I saw an odd anomaly, looked back through it. Someone had tied a bike to one of these bollards. Completely disrupts the flow of pedestrian traffic. One of the kind of most, the saddest experiments that we did is we actually also put a busker, like a street musician there. And unfortunately, this had almost no effect on the pedestrian traffic, and people ignored this poor guy. So pedestrian traffic is a really interesting way of looking at how people use space. And in this case, this is, as I say, kind of a quantitative analysis. And this was the first work that I did on social signal processing and trying to use those social signals as a proxy for understanding behavior and how people use space. This particularly becomes interesting, I think, when we start thinking about behavior in virtual environments. So a lot of the work that I've been doing with Pablo and others is looking at digital proxemics. So how do we use space in a virtual environment? And how do the presence of others influence our behaviors, interactions, and movements? Obviously, in a virtual environment, we have often a fewer subset of the social signals we're used to using, would be represented in quite a different way. And we find that actually people are using space and virtual environments using metaphors from the physical, but many things are still missing. So in a virtual environment, you might be confronted with some interaction like this. This is a space that we've used in Mozilla Hubs regularly. And so you have a few people here. We have some tables, although of course they don't have physical affordance, and you can kind of move around and interact with people. And in this case, we were looking at a couple different specific types of interactions, consensus-seeking tasks, and kind of large group discussions as well. And we have this instrumented virtual environment. We can kind of do a lot richer analysis of the social signals because we have everything from position, body orientation, field of view. If we're using VR, we also have hands. And so we see the way that people are using physical or virtual space. And some of the most interesting results out of this are that actually, for example, we compared people accessing this space in a VR headset versus on a desktop display, and people do use space very differently. When we have people in VR, they actually carve out for themselves a lot more personal space. They stand in groups that seem more familiar to us in terms of like F formations and how people crowd and group. And when we see people in desktop displays, they tend to have collisions in the intimate zone, so they're standing on top of each other and not realizing it. They're not doing things like turning to face the active speaker. And so a lot of the social signals are getting lost a little bit when we talk about virtual space. And so all of this work with the pedestrian traffic and now with the kind of social signal processing in a virtual environment, we're all using, it's often pairwise comparisons of every person to every other person as a time series during interaction. And this has worked really well for analyzing within these two environments. But we are moving towards a space where the kind of reality-virtuality continuum is going to become much more continuous. We're moving between these realities and experiencing things across virtuality, reality. So we might have something more like this in the future. So here I am on the street again, and obviously the pairwise comparisons between me and every physical object might not have the same meaning when I'm also engaging with virtual content simultaneously. So here my pairwise comparisons become, the combinations become a little bit, it's not a useful model anymore. So the work that I'm currently focusing on is looking at how do we fuse social signals across the XR continuum? What are the meaningful signals that are stable, and which are the ones that are changing dramatically how we need to model them when we're moving across the continuum? Because of course here, in a situation like this, we have full reality on one side, full virtuality on the other, and the user, myself, I imagine, moving at different points on that continuum depending on what I need. If someone walks up to you while you're experiencing this, you might dial down virtuality and bring up reality. Or if I want to engage with this kind of virtual person, I might dial down reality and dial up virtuality. So the models for how we are going to fuse signals across these spaces need to dramatically improve so that we can meaningfully capture something here. So I don't have really the full answer to that, but watch this space because I hope I can solve this problem of fusing these signals across. But if we're able to fuse signals across the virtuality-reality spectrum, then I think we can have something which, as I'm calling, this kind of stable interpersonal reality, to make the interactions between people much more stable and have shared points of reference. So a lot of the key open questions here, for example, is how can shared experiences be consolidated when individuals experience materially different realities? We might accept that there's no objective reality, but we are now moving into a space where we are consciously going to personalize our reality and accept that we are not experiencing the same thing, choosing not to experience the same thing together. So how does that impact our interpersonal interactions, and how do we actually maintain stability there when I'm choosing to reject parts of reality? This is a big open question. I also talked about moving back and forth across the continuum. One of the issues that I see emerging as well is that how individuals will make judgments about the reality, virtuality of their experiences. We've been talking about this in terms of reality or virtuality anchors and ways of judging which part of the continuum are you in currently. And again, this is so important for the interpersonal communications so that we have shared anchors, have that stability in the interpersonal interaction. And if we have these anchors across reality, virtuality, I think we can have this stable interpersonal reality. So I'm not quite certain what this is going to look like yet, but this is definitely the direction where I think kind of interaction across the XR continuum will go, and how we can maintain our kind of fundamental social characteristics when we're moving further and further away from pure reality to this continuous space. So thank you, and with that, I'll take some questions.